Hello, it's Randi Rhodes. Here's a clip from our show, and go to RandiRhodes.com for the whole thing and a podcast. Buy a stinking podcast.
You don't just risk losing your money in Russia. You risk dying in Russia. And I don't say that lightly. Sergei Magnitsky, my lawyer, is dead. They tried to kill the family's lawyer by throwing him off a fourth-floor apartment building. A member of the Russian opposition who's helped us with the Magnitsky campaign was poisoned within an inch of his life. A whistleblower who came forward died jogging outside his home in Surrey. They kill, and they kill lots of people, and all it takes is one wrong step doing business in Russia, and you're dead. And so this place is absolutely, completely uninvestable. I would advise everyone to stay as far away from Russia as possible.
Well, our next guest is the most unlikely of human rights activists. We've talked about him a million times, and I looked forward to talking to him today with so much verve, vigor, zest, and zeal. Bill Browder, who is the author of a book called Red Notice that tells the entire story of his time as an investor in Russia, running an investment fund called Hermitage Capital. So welcome, Bill Browder. It's just great to have you. Thank you for taking time today.
Thank you.
So let's discuss this from the top, okay? Sergei Magnitsky, he was your forensic accountant / lawyer in Russia. And Sergei Magnitsky, for whom the Magnitsky Act is named, something you lobbied very hard for, he was the first one to report the money laundering, the $230 million case. Take it from there.
Well, so Sergei discovered a massive government corruption scheme that was taking place, $230 million. He exposed it. He testified against the officials involved. And then some of the same officials who he exposed came to his home on the 24th of November 2008, put him in pretrial detention, where he was then tortured for 358 days to withdraw his testimony and to sign a false confession. He refused, and on November 16th, 2009, he was beaten to death by 8 riot guards with rubber batons. He was 37 years old.
37 years old. Now, what did he find?
What he found was government collusion, or I should say a government conspiracy to steal an enormous amount of money from the Russian government by Russian government officials. And he and I both thought that if that Putin was a nationalist, and that that he wouldn't want his officials to steal $230 million, and if we brought it to his attention, that he would prosecute the people stealing the state money, and the good guys get the bad guys, and that would be the end of the story. But what we discovered was that in Putin's Russia, there are no good guys, and instead of prosecuting the people who stole the money, they prosecuted Sergei.
Now, this is interesting because the money came from the Russian treasury, so it was being stolen from the Russian people, essentially. And Sergei, I guess, found out that is exactly the way Putin wanted it, that the treasury was a piggy bank for oligarchs.
Well, it's a piggy bank for Putin himself. And we were able, over the course of a number of years since this crime happened, since the murder, to trace some of the money back to Vladimir Putin. Now, I should point out that he doesn't have bank accounts in his own name, but a year ago there was this big leak called the Panama Papers leak, where a law firm in Panama that was catering to all sorts of dodgy characters, all of their emails leaked, and from that it was discovered who one of many of Putin's nominees were. And this person who was discovered in the Panama Papers was a cellist, a famous Russian cellist, who was, according to the Panama Papers, worth $2 billion.
And Putin's best friend, right?
And Putin's best friend from childhood, and also the godfather of Putin's children. And this guy is the wealthiest musician in the world, and by far the wealthiest classical musician in the world, with $2 billion that came from Russian oligarchs and Russian state banks into his account. Now, for us, what was most interesting is that we got the names of the offshore companies that he received the money in, and that were his companies, and we traced some of the money from the $230 million that Sergei Magnitsky had uncovered and was killed over to these bank accounts, to these companies, which effectively means that Putin got some of the money. And so what looked to us like some type of mid-level rogue operation turned out to be a high-level thing, effectively going right to the top. And the fact that Putin got caught in this whole thing is one of the reasons why Putin has made this his single largest foreign policy priority, to try to change the narrative of what happened to Sergei Magnitsky and to try to eliminate any consequences from this.
Oh, I thought it was adoption. I thought that was his top priority. Okay, so let me ask you this. How did this case get to the United States? How did Preet Bharara in the Southern District of New York, which is Wall Street and, Manhattan, how did he get the case?
Well, so what happened was, after they murdered Sergei Magnitsky, and I should point out that when I got the news of his death on the 17th of November, 2009, at 7 in the morning in London, it was the worst moment of my life. It was the most heartbreaking, horrible, life-changing news I could have ever gotten. And when I got that news, after the moment of panic and hysteria and all the terrible emotions that flushed through my mind and my body, when I finally was able to calm down enough to sort of look at the situation objectively, I made a decision, which was that I was going to do whatever I had to do, using all resources, time, and energy that I have, to go after the people that killed him and make sure they face justice.
That's amazing. I think that's because you're from the south side of Chicago. I really do. I think it's the way you were raised. So,
I don't know why it is, but for me, I couldn't live with myself unless there was some resolution, there was some justice in this case. It was just so awful what they did to him, and so I made a vow to his to his memory, to his family, to myself, that I was going to pursue these people, whatever it took. And so for the last 7.5 years, that's what I've been doing. And we've had two parts of our campaign. One of them is what I call the political part, which is that when I first tried to get justice inside of Russia, it was obvious what they did to him. We had a ton of evidence. And so we wanted to have the Russians prosecute the people who did it to him for torture and murder. But it turned out that Putin got personally involved in exonerating everybody. He even gave promotions and state honors to some of the people most complicit in this whole affair. And since there was no possibility of getting justice inside of Russia, I said, well, how can we get justice outside of Russia? And I looked around outside of Russia at what the rules and laws were there, and I discovered that there is no, if someone does something like what happened to Sergei, there are no rules or laws outside of Russia that you can use to get any justice. And I was so upset by that, and so felt so powerless by that. I said, well, if there are no laws, then we need to create one. And so I went to Washington, and I met a Democratic senator from Maryland named Benjamin Cardin, and a Republican senator from Arizona, who we all know, John McCain. And I told them the story of what happened to Sergei Magnitsky. And I said, can we, these people who did this, they didn't do this for ideology or religion. They did it for money.
Right.
They did it to cover up the theft of $230 million. And can we, since these guys don't keep their money in Russia, they're too afraid to keep their money in Russia because it's so easy to steal, can we, and they like to travel to the West, can we block their entry to the West, and can we freeze their assets in the West? And these two senators said, yes, let's create a law called the Magnitsky Act. And so the law was created in, it was actually introduced in October of 2010, and I shuttled back and forth between London and Washington for the next 2 years. And in the end, after a lot of conversations and a lot of wearing down the soles of my shoes, it went for a vote in the Senate, and it passed 92-4 in the Senate, and it passed with 89% of the House of Representatives, and it was signed into law by President Obama on December 14th, 2012. And there are now 44 people sanctioned on the Magnitsky list, and we hope many more in the future. That was the first part of our campaign. The second part, to answer your question about Preet Bharara, was that we also, I assigned people on my team to spend whatever time they needed to trace the $230 million that Sergei was killed over and figure out who got that money and to prosecute those people. Mm-hmm. And we've spent that last 7.5 years doing that, and we're now involved with law enforcement agencies in 12 different countries. And remarkably, some of that money went to the United States. Some of that money went to Manhattan, to real estate.
Real estate.
And we found it, real estate properties in Lower Manhattan, condos, marble floors, jacuzzis, the whole thing. And we discovered these wire transfers, and we discovered the properties, and we reported it to the U.S. authorities, to the Department of Justice, and they investigated and confirmed our suspicions, and then they froze those properties and opened up a federal forfeiture case over those properties, and that's how Preet Bharara got involved in this whole story.
Now, he brought the case against a company called Prevazon, right?
Correct. So Prevazon is a Cyprus company owned by a Russian individual who was son of a major Russian government official, and he was one of the people, or his company, I should say, was one of the companies that received money from the $230 million that Sergei Magnitsky discovered, and that was the basis for the case in New York.
So your company was one of the victims of Prevazon. Did you ever see the file?
Well, so I should say my company wasn't the victim. This was the Russian taxpayers' money that was the victim.
I see.
My companies were stolen to then apply for the tax refund of taxes that we paid, but it wasn't our money that was stolen. But I've seen lots of files, and in fact, there's a court docket in New York with 15,000 pages on it of documents all about Prevazon and the money and the tracing that went on and all the back and forth of the legal maneuverings. And I should point out that Prevazon went out and hired the most expensive lawyers they could find in New York, who then charged them the top whack of legal fees, and to run up every single filing and motion and et cetera.
Yeah, I've seen it.
They spent tens of millions of dollars to free what was ultimately frozen, which was $14 million. It was a huge, major operation.
Right. And so the owner of Prevazon is a guy named Denis Katsev, right?
So Denis Katsev is the owner. He's the son of Pyotr Katsev. Pyotr Katsev was a former transportation minister of the Moscow region, which is a region outside of Moscow, which is about the size of France. It's huge. Mm-hmm. His son Denis is a very wealthy young man. Most of his wealth comes from providing transportation services to the region of the Moscow region, where his father was the minister.
Right. Right. And his lawyer was Natalia Veselnitskaya in the Prevazon case in New York, right?
That's correct. So she shows up in New York after their money was frozen, and she runs the most well-resourced, what I call scorched earth campaign in a legal thing I've ever seen. And they were literally spending tens of millions of dollars filing every motion they could possibly file. And then, on top of that, they then started a campaign to repeal the Magnitsky Act.
Right.
And I should point out that the Magnitsky Act, even if they repealed it, which is sort of pie in the sky and very unlikely, even if they did, it wouldn't affect their interests of the money being frozen. The money was frozen based on money laundering statutes, not on the Magnitsky Act. So it was clear that their interests were broader than just what they were doing in court, and which is what brings us to this whole whose interests were they interested in? And the answer is none other than Vladimir Putin.
Right.
Vladimir Putin has made repealing the Magnitsky Act his single largest foreign policy priority for the reasons that I just stated, which is that he got some of the money. And I should also point out that Putin is a very rich man with a lot of money. I mean, and I estimate his wealth to be $200 billion.
Yeah, some people say he's the richest man in the world.
I believe that's to be the case.
Yeah.
And therefore, he's killed a lot of people, tortured a lot of people, and stolen a lot of money.
Well, behind every great fortune, there's a great crime. So you don't get to be that rich being president of the 12th, largest economy in the world unless you steal, kill, and lie. I mean, there's no way to make that kind of money in Russia. Russia is, most people there, $450 a week. I've been there. It's just, it's a sad, sad place. It's a. But tell me, who was Ike Ametchen at Metchen?
So the person you're speaking about, his name is Rinat Akhmetyan.
That's him.
Rinat Akhmetyan was the other person attending with Natalia Veselnitskaya at the Trump Tower meeting with Donald Trump Jr. on the 9th of June 2016. Rinat Akhmetshin is a Russian former military intelligence officer. I say former sarcastically because in Russia there's no such thing as being a former intelligence officer. It's like the Hotel California. You can check out any time you like, but you can never leave. And a very dodgy, shady character. Many people I know who have come across him have been sort of left the meeting, sort of washing their hands and scratching their head. And he was he became a naturalized American citizen. He lives in Washington, and a very recent New York Times story describes him as a master of the dark arts. And I think that's a reasonably accurate description.
Yeah, propaganda, political disinformation. I mean, that's his wheelhouse, right?
Indeed, and he's also very, very skilled at sort of getting into the confidences of people, learning what they want and need, and where their weaknesses are. And he and Natalia Veselnitskaya embarked last spring on a program in Washington to try to approach all the people in power and to try to get the Magnitsky Act repealed.
Right.
And I should say that they didn't do this by themselves. These two Russians didn't just walk around Capitol Hill. They went out and hired some of the very most expensive, best lobbyists, investigators, public relations executives, and lawyers to help them with their project. And lots of people who you wouldn't have expected to be involved in this type of enterprise threw their hat in and took their dollar bills out from this project.
So, do you think Natalia and Rinat knew each other?
I do not know whether they knew each other before, but Rinat is the go-to guy for sleazy projects in Washington D.C., and I'm sure that when Natalia was asking around for advice, his name popped up, and that's how. In any case, they found each other, and it was a match made in heaven. They did a lot of dirty work in Washington in relation to lying about what happened to Sergei Magnitsky, trying to change the narrative in Washington. They promoted a film.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, were you aware of Congressman Dana Rohrabacher receiving a copy of that anti-Magnitsky film from the Prosecutor General Yuri Chaika?
I was familiar with all the intimate details of that story as it was happening. I'm fortunate to have a lot of good friends and places where I could learn about things, and those people told me what was going on, and it was clear that there was that Dana Rohrabacher was in the middle of a Russian FSB operation to achieve the objectives of Vladimir Putin, and it was happening in real time, and we were fighting it in real time, and we succeeded. I mean, as much as he is truly a heinous man for basically turning and getting flipped by the Russians, he didn't have any impact at all on one of his asks. One of the things that they asked him to do was to take Sergei Magnitsky's name off of the global Magnitsky Act, which was a version of the Magnitsky Act which would affect bad guys from anywhere in the world, which the Russians were very offended by because of Sergei Magnitsky's name and the fact that it further entrenched his legacy and his cause. And so they asked him to take his name off of that. And so Dana Rohrabacher introduced an amendment to the global Magnitsky Act at the House Foreign Affairs Committee at their markup of the law, asking for his name to be deleted. And there was a debate. It was very entertaining to watch. And he put forward his arguments, and then every member of the committee basically slammed him down. And I remember Jerry Connolly, a member of Congress, stood up and said, "It sounds like I'm listening to Russia Today."
Yeah.
Dana Rohrabacher speak.
Yeah, and others said there's two people I'm sure that are on Putin's payroll, Dana Rohrabacher and Donald Trump. I mean, everybody was very hip to this. So Rohrabacher's staffer actually wanted to show this in the committee hearing. He wanted to show this movie, and of course nobody would let him. So he showed the movie at the museum. And the Rohrabacher staffer who sent the invitations, a guy named Mr. Berend, who is a friend of Eric Prince, whose sister is our new education secretary, Betsy DeVos, just resigned. So do you think it's because of this?
He didn't resign. He was fired from the House Foreign Affairs Committee staff.
Okay.
And on the day that all the stuff, this bombshell report in the Daily Beast describing his activities was exposed. However, I should point out that later that day, Dana Rohrabacher brought him into his personal staff at his congressional office at the same salary. So Paul Behrens continues to be an employee of the U.S. government, and Dana Rohrabacher continues to live a life of impunity for the actions he took on behalf of the Russian FSB.
California, if you're listening, I'd like to get the emails. I'm sure our media would be very happy to have them. Just saying. All right, so now let me ask you about this strange situation. I know you were supposed to testify on Wednesday of this week, and then they delayed it. Now, are you testifying next Wednesday?
I am indeed. So my testimony is going to be in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee.
Right. Now, I have a question about this, okay? Because I looked at the scheduling here. It looks like you are scheduled at the same hearing as Fusion GPS founder Glenn Simpson. Now, according to what I know about Glenn Simpson, he's a former Wall Street Journal reporter, and he started Fusion GPS, and he was doing opposition research on you. And at the same time, he hired Chris Steele to investigate Trump. And you filed a FARA complaint with Congress saying that you wanted Fusion to be registered as a foreign agent. And now it seems both of you are going to testify, I'm guessing, on separate panels, but together. How is that going to work?
Well, we're not on separate panels. We're in the same panel, sitting at the same table.
How do you feel about that?
I feel great about it. This is an opportunity. You know, he's another one of these dark arts guys. He runs professional smear campaigns in Washington for hire. He was working for the Russian government for their interests. Didn't register under the Foreign Agents Registration Act, which is a requirement.
Yeah, nobody does anymore. It seems so 20th century.
Well, and that's the purpose of this hearing, which is that Senator Grassley learned about my criminal complaint filed with the Department of Justice against this whole team of people that have been hired by Veselnitskaya and Akhmetshin, which includes Glenn Simpson, Chris Cooper, who is a former Wall Street Journal reporter, Mark Simrod, a lawyer from Baker Hostetler,
right?
Ron Dellums, a former Democratic congressman, and Howard Schweitzer, former Exim Bank official. All of these people didn't register as foreign agents. The laws are very clear that they should. There is very little, if no, enforcement of the law, and therefore foreign governments we do all sorts of dirty business without anyone knowing that they're up to it. And so my pitch, which they seem to believe is true, is that this is a particularly stark example of how foreigners are trying to influence U.S. policy unregistered, and the Department of Justice didn't do anything about it. And so this may be the case, the straw that breaks the camel's back, and maybe there will be some revision in the FARA legislation so that the rules can be enforced more aggressively and real consequences can be meted out on people who don't abide by those rules.
So now Paul Manafort is one of those, and he's supposed to be at that same hearing, and so is Junior. Got any thoughts about what you might say to them if you run into them in the cloakroom or wherever they're going to keep you?
Well, I don't know either of these individuals, and I really don't have much to say to any of them. I mean, my role there is to testify and to answer questions from members of the Senate Judiciary Committee. You
think Grassley is going to be friendly to you, or do you think his interest in Fusion, aside from your FARA complaint, is really about the Chris Steele dossier? Because it is interesting that Fusion did both those same things at the same time. On the one hand, they're investigating you, and on the other hand, they're investigating Trump. And they say that, a Democratic, donor or Democrats hired Fusion at that same time. Isn't that odd? I mean, are there I guess in the dark arts, there's no conflict laws, right?
Well, I should point out that he was doing more than just investigating. He was basically contacting journalists and knowingly spreading false information about what happened, how Sergei Magnitsky came to die, and about Sergei Magnitsky's circumstances prior to his death.
Yeah, they want to say that you're the person who stole the money and that Sergei was part of that, and they want to just ruin his. Posthumously, they tried him in Russia, which is bizarre. You said not even Stalin did that, and then of course they're trying to just smear his reputation. Let me ask you before I let you go: who else was killed, and are you afraid? I mean, you talked about Nikolai Gorokov, right? He took photos of documents that had to do with the Prevazone case, and suddenly he falls out of a window moving a bathtub, right?
He didn't fall out of a window. He was thrown off of a balcony on the 4th floor of his apartment building the night before he was going to be giving evidence in a Moscow court in order to expose newly discovered documents showing complicity between the police and the criminals who connected to the Magnitsky's death. He thankfully he's in his early 50s. He went down 4 stories. But thankfully, he survived the fall. He didn't survive it unblemished. He had a number of broken bones, including facial bones. But he did survive, and he's recovering now.
Now he took photos of those documents, didn't he?
He took photos of documents which were also going to be used in the Prevazone case in New York, and in fact, those were the key documents which would have allowed the government to win their case had the case actually gone to court, which it didn't. It got settled on the courtroom steps.
Now, I wanted to ask you something. Louise Shelley, who was an expert witness who was supposed to testify at that trial, and Sergei Magnitsky's law partner, James Firestone, there was a lot of disappointment around that settlement. I mean, they fired Preet Bharara, and then like a month and a half later, 6 weeks later, the whole thing is settled. And they were very disappointed, but you said it was a good deal. Why?
Well, basically, in simple financial terms, the government, we together with the government investigated, and the government was only able to trace $2 million to these people. And so, at the time, they had $14 million frozen, and they only were able to trace 2. And so, if they got 3 times 2, I thought that was a pretty good outcome for them,
get it.
Just purely on a mathematical basis. Now, having said that, I, like everybody else, would have been very happy to get a court judgment against them. But I also understand why the Department of Justice would have done this, because it's a highly complicated financial money laundering case, and you have just regular folks sitting on the jury.
Yeah, they thought they'd lose the jury. Yeah, and
who knows? I mean, it's just not worth it. They had an extremely strong case. It was an excellent case, but who knows? You just don't know what you get somebody who's a mechanic or a hairdresser, what do they know about money laundering coming from Russia? So it's better. I think from their perspective, and they do this a lot. I mean, it's not like just this case. They settle lots of cases. Now, I can see the logic. I can see the practice. What I'd like to know, and I think a lot of other people would like to know, is were there any telephone calls made from Main Justice in Washington to the Southern District, which had any impact on the outcome of that case? And I don't know the answer. I don't know the answer to that case.
Nobody does.
That question.
Nobody does.
And I think that will be answered sooner or later. And it does.
You think?
I think that this is one of the things which I believe
Bob Mueller,
a number of senators and congressmen have also asked the question. So we'll see. I mean, I don't think that when you have these types of situations, there are no long-term secrets. The truth will come out on the whole situation, and I think that there's a pretty high chance that this is a totally legitimate function of the U.S. Department of Justice. But there's a small chance that it wasn't, and we'll find out.
Yeah. Who was the other man that was poisoned? Who was that person in this scenario?
Well, there's several people. The first person is a close friend of mine, a young man named Vladimir Kara-Murza. Vladimir Kara-Murza was the protege of Boris Nemtsov, a famous Russian politician who was murdered in February 2012, 2015 in front of the Kremlin on the bridge. His protege, Vladimir Kara-Murza, is my friend and my confidant as we run around the world trying to get Magnitsky Act passed. He's been there with me in Brussels at the European Parliament, in Ottawa at the Canadian Parliament, in Congress, in the British Parliament, talking on behalf of the Russian people about why the Magnitsky Act needs to be passed. and he was poisoned in Moscow and went into coma, multiple organ failure, coma for a month, and he came within an inch of his life, and it's only because of his strength of character that he somehow pulled through, and he was able to survive. Another person who wasn't so lucky was a guy named Alexander Parapolichny. Alexander was not a friend of ours. He was a member of the criminal enterprise that pulled off this crime. He ended up falling out with his collaborators in a very dangerous and bad way. And he came to us in London. He fled to London, moved his family to London, and he came to us in London with information about where some of the money went from this crime, which led us to the Swiss authorities, who froze roughly $20 million at Credit Suisse and UBS belonging to the bad guys. And
are you afraid at all? I mean, I'm sure you have security. Are you fearful? I mean, everybody's watching this case with regard to Trump's connection to Russia, so everybody's going to be watching this testimony next Wednesday. I mean, usually it's just dorks and geeks like me, but now everybody's interested. They're going to all see you. They're going to see you. They're going to hear the story, some for the first time. Are you afraid?
Well, I mean, I'm on the very top of Putin's kill list. I've been there for a long time. They've made threats against me on a number of occasions. They've organized plots against me. They've tried having me arrested on using Interpol arrest warrants on multiple occasions. They've tried to have me extradited from England, where I live. They've sued me. They've sued me for defamation. They've sued me for money. They've sued me all different ways. They've opened up lots of criminal cases against me in Russia. They've tried making movies about me. I mean, I'm fully in their sights. There's probably 200 to 250 people working full time on the anti-Bill Browder effort in Moscow. So am I afraid? I mean, I wouldn't say I'm afraid, because I'm used to it at this point. But I'm seriously at risk of a violent and unpleasant death that could happen at any moment.
Oh, for Pete's sake! I mean, did you see? Did you ever see the testimony? I'm sure you did, of Clint Watts, the cybersecurity guy, former FBI guy, who was trying to tell the Senate back, a few months ago, how the Senate was asking. Well, I think it was Ron Wyden, senator from Oregon, and he was saying, how do we even approach this? And he said, follow the dead Russians. Did you see that?
I didn't see it, but I read it, and there's definitely lots of truth to that. And the Russians are good at killing people and doing it in a plausibly deniable way. So,
well, listen,
that's what they do.
I'll be watching Wednesday. I hope to God our Senate is smart enough to ask the right questions. I hope to God they're curious enough about all of these little details and figure stuff out for once. If they haven't read, maybe they should over the weekend. Your book, Red Notice, and Red Notice, of course, refers to these Interpol notices. I mean, I've sent people over to Amazon, not just to buy it, but for people who want to read it. The first chapter is there, and you can read it for free, and it'll just, the hair on your arms will stand out, the back of your neck. What you have been through is amazing, and that you started at, I mean, you're a Stanford graduate, you thought, business would be your thing, and then all of a sudden you end up being like one of the biggest human rights activists in the world. This has got to be, shocking for you.
Well, I don't. It's hard for me to step outside my body and look at myself objectively. It just feels like.
Well, what does your wife say?
I mean, we don't. We most of the time we don't choose our destinies. They come to us in different ways.
You're right.
My destiny, and I'm going to pursue it with all the vigor I have to try to do the right thing and try to make justice happen and live a righteous life.
You are the most unlikely hero in this entire Russia tale so far, and I have to say I am so thrilled and excited that you gave me the courtesy of emailing me back and forth and setting this up and coming on here and answering these questions. I just wish that case had not been. I mean, I would love to have been able to follow the money that went into these New York real estate deals, that went into these high-end condos. Where are those files? Do you know? I mean, I'm sure Bob Mueller has them.
Oh, no, there's a court docket with 15,000 pages on it. You can go to the court docket and sign in and look at all the files. They're there.
In the Southern District of New York?
United States versus Prevozone on the docket. There's 15,000 pages. Everything you want to know is all there. Have fun. It's good reading.
I guess you just planned my whole weekend for me. Thank you. Listen, Bill Browder, unlikely hero, amazing human rights guy, really didn't start out this way. He's right. Fate chooses you. It's not for you to choose. I will be watching Wednesday. Our whole audience will be watching Wednesday. And if you feel the need to come and talk to us after that would be great too.
Great.
Thank you
so much for your time and interest.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you. Well, that's a story that everybody ought to hear over and over and over and over again. This is the story of Sergei Magnitsky, who was a lawyer to that man, Bill Browder. This is the man, Magnitsky, who first reported the money laundering in Russia coming from the Russian treasury. And Bill Browder went, they killed him. They put him in jail. His health failed. They beat him with a rubber hose till he died. And Bill Browder was man enough and big enough and a good friend enough to travel the world till he could find a venue where he could bring these money launderers to some sort of idea of justice. And that was the Prevozone case. And Natalia Veselnitskaya and this, Renat Akhmedov, all these people that were in that meeting with Junior, they were all connected to that case. What are the odds? See, it's like you don't choose your destiny, but also, jot this down. There are no coincidences. Not in this story. There are too many dead Russians. There are too many people who have sacrificed everything, including their lives, so that maybe one day we would know the truth. And we will one day know the truth. And that is the message that Bill Browder wants to bring. Don't worry, you will know the truth soon. So next Wednesday, what a doozy of a week. What a doozy of a hearing that's going to be at Senate Judiciary. You got Junior, you got Manafort, you got the guy from Fusion GPS, Glenn Simpson, and you got Bill Browder, all testifying to the same committee on the same day, Wednesday. And a guy who's done opposition research against Browder sits next to him. Wow. I mean, now you can really watch and see the intrigue, even before one question is asked.